Hey everyone, tonight we're going back, and we're going back to the bathroom mirror at 6:30 in the morning, where the real education happened. We've got a full day inside the beauty rituals that women in the 1960s inherited from their mothers and performed with the seriousness of surgical procedure. Every cream and pin and clever trick carried forward from one generation to the next like heirloom jewellery, except more useful. We have got the story of Helena Rubinstein, the woman who sold American women the idea that beauty was not a luxury but a science, and who built a cosmetics empire out of sheer force of will and an almost frightening understanding of what women wanted to believe about themselves. We have got a day behind the beauty counter at a department store in the early 1960s, where the salesgirl was expected to be a walking advertisement, a tactful therapist, and an extremely patient human being, all at once, for a salary that did not come close to compensating for any of it. And we have got the hidden history behind the gleaming ideal itself, the things the beauty industry was not advertising, the ingredients no one was announcing, the expectations being quietly enforced under layers of powder and social pressure. So before you get settled, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending time here. And leave me a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. I love seeing that. Now get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket up, and let us go back together. It begins before the alarm, before the house stirs, before the coffee percolates, before the particular sound of your husband turning over in bed reaches you through the wall. You are already awake. Not because you planned it that way, not because you set a second clock, but because your body has been trained by routine to anticipate the morning the way a well-wound watch anticipates the hour. The room is still dark. The curtains are drawn, and through them comes the faint amber suggestion of a streetlight and nothing else. The air in the bedroom holds the particular coolness of a house that has been closed all night, with its layers of sleep and wool and something faintly floral from the cold cream you applied before bed. That smell, faintly floral and slightly medicinal at once, is one of the defining smells of your mornings. You've been using the same cold cream since you were 19. Your mother used it before you. There is a comfort in that continuity that you have never put into words but which sits somewhere in you like a quiet, steady current. You sit up slowly and the first thing you reach for is not the lamp. The first thing you reach for is the cold cream, or rather, the absence of it. You notice it on your face, the way it has settled into your skin overnight, doing whatever it is that cold cream does when left to its own devices in the dark. Your mother told you to apply it every single night without exception. She said skin that was never moisturized was skin that aged before its time, and she said this with the authority of a woman who had seen it happen to neighbours, to aunts, to women who had skipped steps and paid for it in their 40s. You took her at her word. You still do. The bathroom is small and familiar in the way that only a room you have stood in every morning for years can be familiar. The light fixture above the mirror throws a warm yellow light that is simultaneously flattering and completely useless for applying makeup with any accuracy, a fact you discovered the hard way and have since adapted to by leaning in close and doing the important work by feel as much as by sight. The tiles are cold under your feet. The radiator in the corner has not yet come fully to life. You pull your robe tighter and begin. The first step is the face wash, and it is nothing like what magazines would later recommend. You do not use a gentle foaming cleanser. You do not use lukewarm water and a soft cloth in gentle circular motions. You use soap. A specific bar soap that your mother also used, held at an angle under running water and worked into a lather between your palms before being applied to your face with a brisk efficiency that would make a modern esthetician quietly weep. Your mother's advice on this was simple. Clean skin was the foundation of everything, and thoroughness was not optional. You rinse with water that is slightly too cold, which your mother said closed the pores, though neither of you ever questioned exactly what that meant or whether it was true. It felt like it worked. That was enough. Then comes the toner, if you can call it that. The word toner is not one you use. What you use is witch hazel, poured onto a cotton ball from a dark glass bottle that lives on the edge of the sink beside the soap dish. The cotton ball goes across your face in long, sweeping strokes, and when it comes back slightly grey despite the washing, you feel the satisfaction of evidence. You're thorough. Your mother was thorough. Thoroughness is a virtue. The cold cream goes on next, worked in small circles from the jaw upward toward the forehead, because your mother told you that the direction of application mattered. that you were either encouraging the skin or discouraging it, and she was a woman who did not leave these things to chance. You used the ring finger on your right hand, the weakest finger, because your mother said the ring finger applied the least pressure and therefore the least damage to delicate tissue. You learned this when you were perhaps 15, sitting on the edge of the bathtub watching her perform this same ritual, and you remember thinking that she looked like she was praying over her own reflection. You understand it better now. The cold cream stays on for exactly 5 minutes. Not 4, not 7, 5, because that was the number, passed down with the solemnity of a recipe. You use the time to set your hair, which was put up in pin curls the night before and covered with a hairnet, and which now needs to be released and sorted and coaxed into the shape it will hold for the day. You pull out the bobby pins one by one, placing them in the ceramic dish beside the sink that exists for this purpose only, and you begin to work the curls loose with your fingers, lifting and separating and pressing gently, feeling for where the set is firm and where it has gone soft overnight. This is the part your mother was expert at. She could look at a set of pin curls and tell you within seconds whether they had been wound correctly the night before, whether the tension had been even, whether the hair had been damp enough when it went up. She had opinions about dampness that she could articulate with precision. Too wet and the curl went limp, too dry and it never quite set. There was a moisture level, which she described as just past damp, that produced the result she was looking for, and she'd been able to hit it by feel since she was a girl. You're still, at 34, not quite as reliable as she was, but you're better than you were at 20. The cold cream comes off with a soft cloth, and underneath it your skin feels different than it did before. Softer, warmer, slightly luminous in the yellow light. You lean into the mirror to assess. Assessment is a daily ritual unto itself, conducted with a mixture of honesty and optimism that is one of the more quietly complicated emotional exercises in your morning. You notice the small lines beginning at the corners of your eyes that were not there 5 years ago. You notice the shadow beneath them from the hour of sleep you missed worrying about something you cannot even remember now. You notice the good things too, the evenness of your skin tone, the width of your cheekbones, the things your mother pointed out when she was teaching you to see yourself correctly. She said that women who looked in mirrors and saw only problems were doing themselves a disservice, and the mirror a discourtesy. You try to remember that. Foundation comes next, and this is an operation of some precision. Your foundation is a liquid one, and you apply it with your fingertips in the technique your mother demonstrated on your face when you were 17, pressing and blending in short strokes from the centre outward, taking it down past the jaw in the motion she called feathering, which prevents the line of demarcation that marks a woman who does not know what she is doing. Your mother felt strongly about the line of demarcation. She felt it was visible from across the room, and that people noticed it without knowing what they were noticing. You have never tested this theory, but you feather your edges with conviction. The powder is a compact you have owned for 3 years and refilled twice. The scent of pressed powder is one of the smells of your entire life, from the moment you sat beside your mother at her dressing table and watched her apply it with the flat velour puff in the upward and press motion she used to this very morning. The smell is violet and talc and something underneath both of them that has no name, but that is simply the smell of getting ready, of transformation in progress, of the day about to begin. You press the puff across your face, the forehead first, then the cheeks, then the chin, tapping the excess off against the inside lid of the compact, because your mother taught you that shaking the puff created dust and that dust was wasteful. The eyebrows come after powder, and this is where you feel your mother's instruction most acutely. Your mother had strong opinions about eyebrows. She had them shaped at a salon every 3 weeks throughout your entire childhood, and in between visits she maintained them herself with tweezers and a small magnifying mirror she kept in the second drawer of her dressing table. She taught you to tweeze only from below the brow, never from above, because the arch belonged to God or genetics and was not yours to improve upon through removal. She taught you to fill in with a pencil that was exactly 1 shade darker than your natural hair colour. Not 2 shades, not matching, 1 shade darker and no more. She demonstrated this on paper once, the correct shade and the incorrect shade side by side, so you would understand the difference visually before you attempted it on your own face. You fill in your brows now with the short, feathery strokes she showed you, following the natural line outward toward the temples, lightening the pressure at the tail so it fades rather than stops. Your mother's eyebrows were one of the things people commented on. strangers. People said she had lovely brows. She accepted the compliment graciously and said that she had learned from her own mother, who had learned from hers. There is a line of women in your family going back to somewhere before anyone can remember who knew how to do the eyebrows correctly, and you are part of that line. Mascara is next, applied with the small brush wand that you have had to coax product from with increasing determination, because the tube is getting low and there is no time to go to the drugstore today. You do the upper lashes first, wiggling the wand at the base as your mother instructed, because she said the wiggle distributed product to the root and added volume that a simple sweep would miss. Then the lower lashes, much more lightly, with the tip of the brush. Your mother warned you about lower lashes done too heavily. She said it made a woman look tired before she had started the day, and that there were enough things already making women look tired without their mascara joining in. Lipstick is the final act, and it is not a small thing. Lipstick selection in the early morning is a decision about the day, about who you intend to be in it, about the message you're intending to send before you open your mouth to say a word. You have 5 shades in the small basket on the bathroom shelf. Your mother kept 11. She organised them by occasion the way a carpenter organises tools, with a clarity of purpose that you admired even before you understood it. She had a teaching lipstick, a grocery lipstick, a dinner-out lipstick, a church lipstick, and several others for occasions with more nuanced social requirements. You have not yet achieved her level of categorisation, but you understand the principle. You choose a coral pink today, a shade your mother gave you 2 Christmases ago with the observation that it suited your colouring better than the red you'd been wearing. She was right. She was usually right about these things in a way that was not always easy to receive graciously in the moment, but that you recognised as accuracy after the fact. You apply it with a brush, because your mother applied lipstick with a brush, and said that a brush gave you control that the bullet alone could not. You blot once on a folded square of tissue. You check the result in the mirror, first straight on, and then at each side. There is one more step, and it is not one that appears in any magazine you have read or any beauty column in the newspaper. Your mother called it setting the face, and it involves taking a single sheet of tissue paper, the good kind, and pressing it firmly against your entire face, then removing it. She said this removed the excess oil from the powder and created a surface that would last through whatever the day chose to throw at it. She said her own mother had taught it to her, and that it was old knowledge, the kind that predated advertising and therefore predated the companies that would prefer you reapply throughout the day and buy more product. She said that with a particular satisfaction. You press the tissue against your face in the bathroom where the light is still that warm, inadequate yellow, and when you pull it away you look at the faint impression it has taken, the ghostly mirror of the face you have just constructed, and there is something quietly strange and wonderful about that. The idea of your face existing twice for a moment, once on you and once on a piece of tissue that will go into the wastebasket and be gone. You look in the mirror one more time. The woman looking back at you is assembled, she is ready. The hair takes another 15 minutes, and these 15 minutes are a negotiation between what you planned last night when you set the pin curls and what the morning has decided to offer you. The back section is perfect. The right side is exactly what you wanted. The left side, specifically the area above your ear, has developed a flatness that no amount of teasing is going to fully redeem, and you know this the way you know certain reliable truths about your life. You backcomb the crown section with the rat-tail comb your mother gave you, working in layers, building volume from underneath because your mother said that you never teased the surface. You built from beneath and let the surface rest on top of the structure you had created. This distinction made the difference between a style that held and a style that collapsed by 11 in the morning. Hairspray is the final act of the hair, and it is applied at a distance of approximately 10 to 12 inches, moving in slow, even arcs, because your mother said that the application of hairspray at close range created stiffness, and that the goal was not stiffness but hold. The difference between stiffness and hold was not one she could always articulate, but you had learned it by observation and by your own results over time. You spray and let it dry for 30 seconds, then spray once more lightly over the crown for insurance. Then you do not touch it. Your mother was emphatic about not touching it after the spray. You respect that. You look at yourself in the full-length mirror on the back of the bathroom door before you go downstairs. This is not vanity, or at least it is not only vanity. It is the professional's final check before the project leaves the workroom. You're checking for things that need correcting before you are visible to the day, a collar that needs straightening, a line of powder that has not been blended at the hairline, a wrinkle at the skirt that came from the hanger and needs addressing with your hands before it sets. Your mother did this. Her mother did this. The mirror is not the enemy. The mirror is the last collaborator before you walk out the door. What you understand now, in a way you did not fully understand when you were learning all of this, is that the beauty routine you inherited from your mother was never purely about appearance. It was a practice in the older sense of the word, a daily discipline, a form of attention and intention and self-regard that was its own reward even when no one outside the bathroom would ever know the effort that went into it. Your mother performed this routine on mornings when she was ill. She performed it when she was grieving. She performed it when she was exhausted in ways that went beyond the physical. She did it because the routine was stable when other things were not, because it required her full attention and therefore gave her a brief pocket of time each morning that belonged entirely to her and her own two hands, and the familiar smell of cold cream and powder, and the yellow light above the mirror. The kitchen is waiting. The coffee is waiting. The day, with its full ambitions and unannounced complications, is waiting. But for just a moment longer you stand in the bathroom, and you think about the women who taught you this, and the women who taught them, all the way back through the chain of mornings and mirrors, and there is something in that thought that is both very small and very large at the same time. You turn off the bathroom light, you go downstairs. The routine is complete. The day can begin now. But before we get to the mirror, we need to get to the evening before, because the morning routine that your mother taught you was never only a morning routine. It was a cycle, and the cycle began the night before with the same deliberateness that the morning required, and if you skipped any part of the evening, the morning showed it. This is one of the things about inherited beauty knowledge that is not always understood from the outside. It is not a collection of individual tips. It is a system, and the system has internal logic, and the parts depend on each other the way the parts of any carefully designed thing depend on each other. The evening begins with the removal. Your mother called it taking off your face, and she meant it literally, not as a figure of speech. The face you put on in the morning was not the face you went to bed in. You removed it completely, every layer, and you did not do this quickly or carelessly. You did it with the same attention you brought to the application, because your mother said that the skin breathed at night, and that sealing it under makeup was the same as not changing the sheets, technically adequate for one night, a serious error as a regular practice. Cold cream was the remover, not a separate cleansing oil, not a dedicated makeup remover, not the micellar water that did not yet exist. Cold cream, applied with the same upward circular motion as the moisturizing application, but worked in with more thoroughness, pressed into the skin and then wiped away with a soft cloth that came away dark and that you rinsed and used again and rinsed again until it came away clean. This could take several applications depending on the day and what you had worn. A full face with eyeshadow and mascara and lipstick on top of foundation required patience. Your mother was patient. She had taught you to be patient with the task. The cloth she used was a specific cloth, not a washcloth from the bathroom closet, but a collection of soft cloths cut from worn cotton flannel, hemmed on the sewing machine with a small neat stitch, kept in a stack beside the cold cream. These cloths had a particular softness that came from many washings, and that she said was the only correct texture for removing cosmetics without creating the mechanical friction that aged skin prematurely. She washed them in hot water and hung them to dry on the small rack above the radiator and replaced them when they wore too thin. This level of attention to a piece of cloth seems, from the outside, like an extravagance of time. From the inside of the practice, it was simply the correct approach. After the cold cream came the toner, the witch hazel on the cotton ball, applied with the same sweeping strokes as the morning application, but with the additional satisfaction of seeing what the evening had accumulated. After a full day, the cotton ball came back considerably greyer than it did in the morning, and there was in this a kind of honesty about what the world deposited on you over the course of a day that your mother found useful to contemplate. She said that keeping the face clean was not vanity but hygiene, and that the distinction mattered. Vanity was about appearance, hygiene was about health. Both were relevant, but they were not the same thing. The night cream was different from the day cream. This was a distinction your mother felt strongly about and that you absorbed without question as a child, and have since come to understand with more specificity. The day cream, light and quickly absorbed, provided a base for the foundation and a layer of protection from the environment. The night cream was heavier, richer, designed to sit on the skin for hours and do its work slowly and thoroughly, and it smelled different, more medicinal, more functional, less floral. It was applied last, after the toner, after the eye cream that your mother used specifically for the area around the eyes, because she said the skin there was different from the skin on the rest of the face and required its own formulation. The pin curls were set after the face was done, because setting the hair required both hands and you did not want to disrupt the night cream by pressing your hands against your face. You sectioned the hair and worked methodically from the front to the back, rolling each section into a flat circle against the scalp and securing it with 2 crossed bobby pins, because 1 pin allowed movement and 2 pins held the curl in place with the reliability the system depended on. The tension was consistent, neither too loose nor too tight. Your mother had demonstrated the correct tension by having you feel her fingertip pressed against your wrist at varying pressures until you understood what you were aiming for, which was firm but not unyielding, which was a distinction that took practice to produce reliably. The hairnet went over the finished set, a fine mesh that held everything in place while you slept, and that came away in the morning leaving the curls intact or nearly so, depending on how you moved in your sleep and which side you favoured, and depending on the quality of the pins and the tension of the set, and approximately a dozen other variables that you learned to account for over years of practice. Your mother could assess a completed set before you went to bed and tell you with accuracy whether the result the next morning would be what you wanted. This seemed like magic when you were 15. It seems like expertise now. All of this, the removal and the toner and the night cream and the eye cream and the pin curls and the hairnet, took approximately 45 minutes on an ordinary weeknight. 45 minutes at the end of a day that had already been full before you could reasonably claim the night as your own. Your mother performed this routine without exception. She performed it when she was tired and when she was ill, and when there had been a disagreement with your father that had not yet been resolved, and when the children had been difficult, and when the week had used everything she had. She performed it because she had decided that it was worth performing, and having decided that, she did not re-decide it every evening. What you understood gradually, watching her, was that the routine was a form of self-possession in a life that had very little space for it. The 45 minutes in the bathroom were 45 minutes that belonged to her, in a way that almost nothing else in the day did. The kitchen belonged to the family, the living room belonged to the family, the bedroom was shared, but the bathroom in the evening, with the door closed and the routine underway, was genuinely hers, and the practice of the routine was a practice in caring for a body that spent most of its time caring for everyone else. This was never articulated. It did not need to be. You absorbed it through the example the way you absorbed everything important about the way a life could be conducted. The morning then arrives with its particular quality of continuation. You wake into the life of the evening before, and the face that greets you in the mirror is the face that the night cream and the sleep have worked on together, and it is both familiar and slightly improved, which is the promise the system makes and, in your experience, generally keeps. The ritual of removal and preparation made the skin supple, in ways that one-directional care could not achieve. Your mother had clear complexion from her 30s into her 60s, and she attributed it to consistency. You believe her. Consistency is its own kind of product. The particular pleasures of the morning routine are small and real, and not something that anyone outside the practice understands well. There is the pleasure of the cold cream's texture in the first seconds of contact with warm skin. There is the pleasure of the toner's clean, sharp smell, the witch hazel that cuts through the warmth of the morning and brings you fully awake. There is the pleasure of the eyebrow pencil moving in the short, precise strokes that produce the right result, the slight satisfaction of a hand that knows what it is doing and does it. There is the pleasure of the lipstick's completion, the last deliberate act before the face is finished, the small visual signal that the routine has reached its end and the day can begin. Your daughter watches you sometimes from the bathroom door in the early morning, still in her pajamas, still soft with sleep, and you see in her face the same expression you must have worn watching your own mother perform this ritual 20 years ago. The expression is a mixture of curiosity and comfort, the comfort of witnessing something regular and skilled and known, something that will be there again tomorrow in exactly the same order. You're already thinking about when you will begin teaching her, what you will start with, which parts to introduce first. The ring finger technique, probably, and the direction of application, and the simple, crucial fact that you never go to bed without taking it all off first. The beauty secrets your mother gave you are not secrets in the conspiratorial sense. They are secrets in the older sense, the sense of knowledge that travels by proximity and demonstration, and trust rather than by publication or broadcast. They live in the specific angle of a wrist applying cold cream and in the exact pressure of a fingertip, testing the moisture level of hair before pin curls, and in the particular shade of eyebrow pencil, one shade darker and no more, and in the remembered weight of a mother's hand on your shoulder, looking at your reflection together in the bathroom mirror saying that this is how we do it, this is the way, watch carefully because this is something worth knowing. The question of hair is its own education, and it is one that your mother approached with the seriousness of a craftsperson who has mastered a material over decades and has opinions about its behaviour in every season and climate condition. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Your hair was hers to observe from the beginning, first as an infant, then as a small child sitting on the kitchen chair with a towel around your shoulders while she worked with comb and scissors and the specific vocabulary of hair that she had developed over years of practice. She knew your hair the way a gardener knows a particular plot of land, its tendencies, its reliable responses, its surprising exceptions to those responses, the conditions under which it behaved, and the conditions under which it decided not to. The bouffant was the defining silhouette of the early 1960s, and achieving it at home without a professional roller set was one of the more demanding exercises in the home beauty curriculum. The height and fullness of the bouffant did not come from the hair itself, but from the structure beneath it, from the teasing and the shaping and the precise placement of the setting that had been done the night before in anticipation of the morning's result. Your mother said that a bouffant built on a pour set was a bouffant waiting to happen, by which she meant waiting to happen in the wrong direction, downward toward the floor rather than upward toward the ceiling, and this would occur at exactly the moment in the day when its occurrence was most inopportune. The raytail comb was an instrument of some precision, and using it correctly was a matter of technique rather than force. You lifted the section of hair to be teased and held it at the angle your mother had demonstrated, which was roughly 45 degrees from the scalp, and you inserted the comb at the midpoint of the section and pushed it downward toward the root in short, deliberate strokes, feeling the resistance build as the back combing created the mesh of structure that the surface hair would rest on. Too much force, and you created tangles that were difficult to comb out without breaking hair. Too little, and the structure had no substance. There was a middle path, and your mother had walked it so many times that she could demonstrate it in poor light, with conversation happening around her. Setting lotion was one of the more quietly important products in the home hair care arsenal, and it is one that tends to be absent from nostalgic accounts of mid-century beauty routines because it is not as photogenic as a lipstick or as emotionally resonant as a perfume. But setting lotion was what made the pin curl and the roller set work. It was applied to damp hair before the setting began, distributed with a wide-tooth comb through the sections being prepared, and it provided the chemical scaffolding that held the wave or the curl through the hours of drying and through the subsequent hours of wear. Without it, or with the wrong amount, the set would soften prematurely, and the hours of the previous evening would have been invested for a result that lasted until lunch. Your mother had a particular relationship with humidity that she had developed through experience, and that she communicated to you with the urgency of useful survival information. Humidity was the enemy of a set. Not rain, which you could cover with a scarf, but the ambient moisture content of the air on certain days, which infiltrated a set gradually and invisibly, and produced results that could not be predicted until the damage was already done. She had learned to assess the morning air before she fully committed to a style, stepping outside or simply opening the kitchen window and holding her hand out to test the quality of the day's weather. On high humidity days she chose differently, selected styles that could accommodate the moisture rather than fighting it, and she communicated this flexibility as a principle rather than a concession, because adapting to conditions was not giving up but being practical. The Cold Wave Home Permanent was one of the great equalizers of mid-century beauty, making available to women who could not afford regular salon visits a degree of hair texture that previously required professional intervention. It arrived in the early 1940s and was refined through the decade, and by the time you were old enough to be having your hair considered for a permanent wave, the home kits had become sophisticated enough that your mother was comfortable administering them herself in the kitchen, with the kitchen table cleared and covered with a towel, and the specific smell of the waving solution filling the house in a way that everyone recognized, and that became part of the particular sensory memory of the era. The smell of a home permanent is one of the more distinctly chemical smells of mid-century domestic life, and it is one that requires no description to those who experienced it, and no description will adequately convey it to those who did not. It is the smell of thioglycolate chemistry, which is the chemistry of breaking and reforming the disulfide bonds in the protein structure of hair, and it is not a floral smell, or a pleasant smell, or a smell that anyone would choose to have in their home for other reasons. But it is the smell of transformation, the smell of the hair being unlocked from its current form in preparation for a new one, and your mother administered it with complete confidence and complete equanimity about the smell. The results of a successful home permanent were not the ringlets of Victorian illustration, but a gentler wave, a fullness and a curl that responded to setting in ways that naturally straight hair did not, that held the pin curls better and longer, and produced with the same amount of effort a result that was more reliable and more sustained. This was the practical value. Permanence made the daily routine more efficient. Your mother had calculated this specifically. She knew to within approximately 2 weeks when her permanent was losing its effectiveness, and when the effort required to achieve the desired set was increasing past the point where the permanent was paying its way, and she scheduled the next permanent accordingly. The spring beauty ritual had its own specific requirements, distinct from the winter routine in ways your mother had taught you to anticipate and prepare for. The heavier moisturizer of winter, applied with generosity against the dry heated air of the house, and the biting cold outside gave way to something lighter as the temperature climbed and the humidity returned to the air, and the skin stopped demanding quite so much, and began instead to demand something different, a balance, rather than a supplement. The transition was not a single day's decision, but a gradual shift over several weeks, a reduction in the night cream richness, a change in the powder formula from the heavier winter one to the slightly lighter spring one, an adjustment to the foundation that your mother made by feel, and that you now also made by feel, testing the texture on the inside of your wrist with the same assessing touch she had taught you. The cold cream that you grew up with had a specific name on the jar, a specific logo, a specific smell that had not changed in the 20-odd years your family had been using it, and this consistency was itself part of its value. You did not have to wonder if the new formula would work the same way, did not have to rediscover the amount to use, or the pressure of application, or the number of minutes before removal. The product's stability over time was a form of reliability that extended to the routine built around it, and the routine built around it was the infrastructure of your mornings, the thing you could depend on to be the same when other things were not. This was not nothing. In the years when other things had been considerably not the same, the cold cream jar on the edge of the sink had been one of the things that was. There is something worth sitting with for a moment before the story of Helena Rubinstein begins, which is the question of who decided that American women needed the beauty industry, and who decided the beauty industry needed American women. Because the two things did not arrive together by coincidence. They arrived together because one very specific person understood something about desire and science and aspiration and social anxiety that no one before her had managed to package and sell in quite the same way. That person stood 4 feet 10 inches tall, spoke with an accent she never tried to hide, and had opinions about cold cream that she was prepared to defend, with the stubbornness of someone who had built an empire on the substance and was not interested in being corrected. Helena Rubinstein was born in Krakow, Poland, in 1872, the eldest of 8 daughters in a moderately prosperous Jewish family whose father sold glassware and held strong opinions about the proper behaviour of young women. Helena held strong opinions back, which did not make for domestic harmony. She was bright and ambitious and constitutionally unsuited to the life that was being arranged for her, and when she was old enough to understand the shape of her future if she stayed, she left. The precise details of how she ended up in Australia in 1900 are somewhat contested, but the most reliable account suggests she arrived with a small amount of money, a relentless sense of purpose, and 12 jars of a skin cream made from a recipe given to her by a Hungarian chemist. Australia in 1900 was not a place with a sophisticated cosmetics market. It was a place with harsh sunlight, unpredictable weather, and a population of women whose complexions were suffering in ways that no one had yet offered a commercial solution for. Helena saw this not as a gap in the market, but as a problem she was positioned to solve, and she set about solving it with the focus of someone who has decided that failure is simply not an available outcome. She opened a small beauty salon in Melbourne. She mixed her Hungarian cream. She sold it at a price that was slightly shocking, because she had understood even then something that would define her entire career, that a product priced too low told the buyer it was not serious, and that women spending money on their complexions wanted to believe they were investing in something real. The cream worked, or at least worked well enough that word spread. Helena reinvested everything she made. She was not interested in comfort. She was interested in expansion. She sent money back to Poland for her sisters, one by one, bringing them over to help her build. The family enterprise she created was one of the more remarkable features of her early career, not a family business in the cozy domestic sense, but a deployment of trusted labour toward a strategic end. She knew who could be trusted, and she knew what each sister was suited to, and she organised accordingly. There was never a moment when Helena Rubinstein's operation looked like an accident. She travelled to Europe and brought back not just products but credentials. She studied with dermatologists in Vienna. She worked with chemists in Paris. She learned the language of science as it applied to skin, and she used it with a fluency that her competitors could not match because most of them were not actually speaking it, just borrowing its vocabulary. Helena genuinely understood the chemistry, or at least she understood enough of it to know what was real and what was marketing, and she was not always interested in that distinction being obvious to her customers. She came back from Europe with a range of products, a scientific vocabulary and a title. She began calling herself Madame Rubinstein, and the title suited her in the way that certain words suit certain people, not as an affectation, but as an accurate description of a presence. She arrived in London before the First World War and opened a salon in Mayfair that immediately attracted the kind of clientele that signalled you had arrived. London was followed by Paris. Paris was followed by New York, where she opened on Fifth Avenue in 1915, and proceeded to take the American market with a strategy that her biographer described as a combination of relentless self-promotion, genuine scientific innovation, and an almost supernatural instinct for what wealthy women wanted to be told about their faces. She was not wrong about any of it. Within a decade, the Rubinstein name was known across the country, and the brand had positioned itself as the premium scientific option in a market that was still largely homemade remedies and drugstore basics. The great competitive rivalry of Helena Rubinstein's career was with Elizabeth Arden, a woman of similar drive and very different temperament, who had also built a cosmetics empire in New York, and who Helena could not discuss without a particular tightness around her mouth that suggested deep and enduring feeling. The two women never directly acknowledged each other in public if they could help it. They moved in the same social circles, competed for the same clientele, stole each other's employees with a cheerfulness that bordered on sport, and maintained a mutual animosity that became one of the great personal rivalries in American business history. People who worked for both women over the years reported that each was perfectly capable of discussing the other's products in terms that belonged to warfare rather than commerce. Helena's advantage over Arden and over most of her other competitors was that she genuinely believed in science, not in the abstract, but in the practical and specific application of chemistry to skin. She hired actual chemists. She established laboratories. She funded real research into what ingredients did what and why, at a time when most cosmetics companies were essentially putting rose water and glycerin into an attractive container and writing poetic copy about it. This did not mean that all of Rubinstein's claims were strictly defensible by modern standards, because they were not, and some of the things she said about the cellular properties of her creams would not survive a peer review process today. But relative to the landscape around her, she was operating from a substantially more rigorous foundation. She was also operating from a more democratic one than her luxury pricing suggested. This was one of the quieter contradictions of her career. Helena Rubinstein charged what wealthy women could afford, and positioned her brand in the luxury tier with great deliberateness, but she also believed, with something close to political conviction, that the ability to care for one's appearance should not be available only to the wealthy. She launched lower-priced lines. She was an early advocate for cosmetics counters in department stores accessible to working women who could not afford her Fifth Avenue salon. She said more than once that every woman deserved good skin, which was partly a marketing statement and partly an actual belief, and the fact that she held both simultaneously was entirely characteristic of the person she was. The women who came to Helena Rubinstein's salons in the 1920s and 30s were not coming simply for a cream. They were coming for a consultation, and the consultation was the product as much as anything that came in a jar. Helena trained her operators to ask questions, to look carefully, to diagnose, to prescribe. She created a vocabulary for different skin types, oily and dry and combination and sensitive, that is still in use today, and she created specific products for each type, which meant that every woman who came through the door had a reason to buy not one product but several, each one addressing a specific aspect of her specific situation. The logic was sound, the science was generally defensible, and the sales strategy was brilliant. Her personal life was complicated in the way that the personal lives of people of great ambition tend to be complicated. Her first marriage to Edward Titus, a journalist and publisher, produced 2 sons and an eventual quiet estrangement that preceded a quiet divorce. Her second marriage, at the age of 66, to a Georgian prince named Archil Gurieli Chiconia, who was more than 20 years younger, was viewed by the press with considerable amusement, and by Helena herself with a forthright lack of interest in anyone else's opinion about it. She built him a men's grooming line as a wedding gift of sorts, because she was a person who expressed affection primarily through commerce. The marriage lasted until his death in 1955. She continued working until the end of her life in a way that was not merely active but genuinely relentless. Into her 90s, she was visiting laboratories, reviewing formulations, approving new products, and offering corrections to packaging decisions in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. She was not a soft boss. She was not a gentle critic. She had survived immigration and poverty and competition, and 2 world wars in a market that would have swallowed most people whole, and she had done it by being more precise and more demanding and more persistent than the situation seemed to require, over and over again, for more than 60 years. She died in April of 1965, at the age of 92 or 94, depending on which source you believe, in the penthouse apartment on Park Avenue that she'd owned for decades. The legacy she left behind was not only the brand, though the brand was substantial. The legacy was the idea itself, the idea that caring for one's skin was a scientific activity that required expertise and good product and serious investment of both time and money, and that this activity was not vanity but maintenance, not indulgence but discipline. This idea, which Helena Rubinstein spent 60 years selling to American women, had become so thoroughly absorbed into the culture by the time she died that it no longer needed to be sold. It was simply assumed. Women in the 1960s who bought cold cream and toner and separate products for different skin types were acting on an understanding of beauty care that Helena Rubinstein had constructed for them, passed through their mothers and their mothers' mothers until it felt like common sense rather than commerce. The women who stood in front of their bathroom mirrors every morning in the early 1960s, following routines they had learned from their mothers, were working from a script that Helena Rubinstein had done more than almost anyone to write. The cleanse, tone, moisturize sequence, the idea of targeted products for specific concerns, the belief that the routine was a daily discipline rather than an occasional indulgence, the understanding that skin was something to be managed and maintained rather than simply washed. All of this had come from somewhere, and a great deal of it had come from a woman who stood 4 feet 10 inches tall and had absolutely no patience for the idea that anything about the female experience could not be improved with the right formulation and the right technique. There is something in Helena Rubinstein's story that belongs to a specific moment in American women's history, the moment when domestically acquired knowledge was beginning to intersect with professionally manufactured product, when the handed-down recipe was being gradually replaced by the branded formulation, and when women were navigating the distance between what their mothers had taught them and what the advertisement in the magazine was now telling them. Rubinstein stood at that intersection and profited from it enormously, but she also, in her complicated way, tried to make the professional knowledge genuinely available, to translate the chemistry into something a woman in front of her bathroom mirror could actually use. Whether she succeeded is a question that probably does not have a single answer, but she asked it seriously, and that, for her time, was not nothing. The story of Helena Rubinstein is, among other things, a story about what the word professional means when it is applied to women. In the first decades of the 20th century, a woman who called herself a professional in the context of beauty was navigating a territory with almost no defined borders. The word could mean an actress. It could mean a woman who made her living from her appearance in ways that respectable society declined to fully approve of. It could mean a saleswoman, which was itself a category of some ambiguity. Helena Rubinstein decided it meant something else. It meant a scientist. It meant an expert. It meant someone whose authority rested on knowledge rather than on gender or social position, and she proceeded to construct and perform that authority with the thoroughness of someone who understood exactly how provisional authority could be for a woman in her situation. She was helped in this construction by the fact that she genuinely knew things. She had spent years learning the chemistry of skin from the most rigorous European sources she could find, and she had an instinct for formulation that was, by the accounts of the chemists who worked for her over the decades, not common. She could smell a formulation and tell you what was missing. She could apply a cream and tell you within days whether it was doing what it was designed to do. She was not a trained chemist in the formal sense, but she was also not pretending to a knowledge she did not have. She was translating genuine expertise into a language that women outside the laboratory could access and act on. The language she chose was medical. Not accidentally medical, not metaphorically medical, but deliberately, specifically, carefully medical. Because in the early 20th century, the word scientific carried more authority for women than almost any other available descriptor. Beauty that was scientific was beauty that was serious. It was beauty that could be discussed in the language of treatment and condition and solution, rather than in the language of adornment and vanity. It transformed the cosmetics purchase from a luxury into a necessity, from a pleasure into a health measure, and this transformation was enormously commercially useful to Helena Rubinstein, and was also, to her credit, not entirely dishonest. She genuinely believed that skincare was a health practice as much as an aesthetic one, and she said so consistently enough that the claim eventually became indistinguishable from conviction. Her salons were designed to look and feel like medical facilities, at least in the aesthetic sense. White walls and professional lighting and technicians in white uniforms who spoke with the calm authority of people who had been trained in specific protocols. The consultation had the structure of a medical examination, the skin assessed, the products prescribed, the regimen outlined. You came out of a Rubinstein consultation with a program, not just a purchase, and the program had the quality of a professional recommendation rather than a commercial transaction, even though it was both. This was deliberate. Helena Rubinstein understood that women wanted permission as much as they wanted product, and that framing the purchase as a doctor's recommendation was the most effective form of permission available. The pricing was one of the more sophisticated aspects of her commercial strategy, and it was one that she had understood from the very first jars she sold in Melbourne. Premium pricing did not simply maximize revenue, it communicated value in a way that lower pricing could not. A woman who spent a significant sum on a moisturizer was a woman who had invested in herself. An investment is a serious activity. It creates commitment. It creates loyalty. It creates the willingness to believe that what you purchased was worth what you paid, because the alternative is to admit that you made a poor decision, and human beings are not naturally inclined to do that. Helena Rubinstein understood this not as cynicism but as psychology, and she applied the understanding with precision. There was also a lower-priced line. There was always a lower-priced line, because Helena Rubinstein had grown up without money and had not forgotten what it felt like to want something that was priced beyond reach. She launched mass-market formulations under different labels and through different distribution channels, and she argued about this with her marketing people for the entirety of her career, because the marketing people were worried about what mass-market products would do to the premium brand's image, and Helena was concerned about something that did not have a neat marketing category. She wanted women who could not afford the Fifth Avenue prices to have access to good product. Not because it was good business, though she argued it that way when she needed to, because she thought they deserved it. The competitive relationship with Elizabeth Arden generated stories that became part of beauty industry lore. The employee poachings were the most frequently told, because they were both true and verifiable. Women who had worked for Rubinstein went to Arden and returned. Women who had worked for Arden went to Rubinstein and returned. The circulation was so well established that it had its own informal economy of salaries and benefits, and the particular institutional knowledge that went with it. When Helena discovered that Arden had hired away one of her chemists, she allegedly responded by buying out 2 of Arden's best sales managers. When Arden responded to that, Helena responded in turn, and the cycle continued with a regularity that both companies eventually incorporated into their planning. What was less frequently told was the similarity between the two women's actual lives, a similarity that both would have vigorously denied. Both were immigrants who had reinvented themselves in America. Both had built their businesses with minimal starting capital and maximum force of will. Both had been married to men who were in some ways considerably less formidable than they were, and who had found this an uncomfortable condition to inhabit for extended periods. Both had faced the specific challenge of being women of extraordinary professional competence in an era that had extremely limited categories for such women, and that frequently responded to them with a combination of admiration and discomfort. Both had responded to that discomfort by being more formidable rather than less, which was probably the only strategy available to them that would not have cost them everything they had built. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Helena Rubinstein's relationship with art is one of the more interesting sidebars in a story that already has several compelling sidebars. She was a serious art collector from early in her career, and she collected with the same informed instinct she brought to formulations, not buying what she was told was important, but buying what she saw with her own eyes in galleries and studios and from artists whose work she understood before it was widely recognized. She collected Picasso when Picasso was not yet the Picasso of the textbooks. She collected African art when African art was being categorized as anthropological rather than aesthetic. She filled her apartments, which were numerous and large, and furnished with the decisive taste of someone who had thought carefully about what the space around her should look like, with work that was extraordinary by any measure. She gave some of it away. She gave art to museums and to universities and to institutions that might not otherwise have had access to the quality of work she owned. She also kept a great deal of it, because she was a collector in the true sense, which means the work had personal meaning beyond its cultural value. And personal meaning is not the kind of thing you give away because an institution has expressed interest. She walked through her apartments looking at the paintings and sculptures with the same attention she brought to her work, the same steady, focused assessment. And you can imagine her, 4 feet 10 inches of absolute conviction, standing in front of a Matisse, considering whether it was hung correctly and whether the lighting was right and whether she had made the right decision acquiring it, and concluding that she had. The empire she built was valued at $60 million at the time of her death, which in 1965 was a sum that required a moment of quiet contemplation to fully absorb. She had built it from 12 jars of Hungarian cold cream, from a small salon in Melbourne, from the accumulated force of 60 years of work that never stopped, not because she'd not earned the right to stop, but because stopping was simply not the way the mechanism inside her operated. People who worked with her in her final years described her as someone who came into the laboratory or the boardroom with an attention that did not seem diminished, who argued about formula and packaging and pricing with the same precision she had brought to everything she'd argued about for 6 decades. What Helena Rubinstein sold to American women was the idea that beauty was a form of self-respect, with a scientific basis, and that practicing it daily was not an indulgence, but a discipline. She sold this idea in jars and in the white interiors of her salons and in the carefully chosen vocabulary of her advertising, and in the authority of her own uncompromising presence. She was not a simple figure. She was capable of both vision and exploitation, of genuine care for women's access to good product and cynical calculation about how to price it. She was a person of enormous complexity who spent 60 years inside an industry that rewarded complexity with money and penalized it with rumors, and she navigated this with a self-possession that never wavered, not publicly, not in any account that survives. The specific products that Helena Rubinstein brought to the American market deserve more than a passing reference, because the formulations themselves were one of the places where her scientific commitment was most visible, and also one of the places where the distinction between genuine innovation and very effective marketing was sometimes difficult to maintain. She introduced the concept of skin type to mass-market cosmetics, building an entire product architecture around the premise that different skins had different requirements, and that a product designed for oily skin applied to dry skin was not only less effective but potentially harmful. This seems obvious now, but in the context of the early 20th century beauty market, where the standard product was designed for all women equally and therefore precisely matched to none of them, it was a meaningful departure. Her Valais range, which she brought to Australia from the Hungarian chemist, whose recipe she had started with and then substantially reformulated over the years, became the flagship of her early operation and remained in some form throughout her career. She updated the formulations as new ingredients became available, as her chemists developed improvements, as consumer preferences shifted, and as the competition introduced new standards that had to be met or exceeded. She was not attached to a formulation for sentimental reasons. She was attached to results, and a formulation that no longer produced the best available results for its stated purpose was a formulation that needed revision. This was her general principle, and she applied it without nostalgia. The treatment room culture she established in her salons was arguably her most lasting institutional innovation, the thing she introduced that shaped the entire professional beauty industry for the following century. The consultation, followed by treatment, followed by product prescription, was not how women accessed beauty services before Helena Rubinstein systematized it. Before her, the standard interaction was transactional. You asked for what you wanted, you received it, you paid, and left. Rubinstein introduced the assessment, the individualized recommendation, the ongoing relationship between the operator and the client, built around the client's specific skin history and ongoing progress. This was not just a business model, it was a philosophy about what professional beauty care was for. She was writing in English from the first year she spent in Australia, not because English was her native language, which it was not, but because it was the language of the market she was operating in, and she had decided to operate in it fully rather than partially. Her advertisements from the early Melbourne period show a command of the aspirational register of beauty copy that would have been impressive in someone who had grown up with the language. She understood which words carried which weight, which phrases communicated authority and which communicated accessibility, and she deployed them with precision. The advertising copy that her agency produced throughout her career was reviewed by her personally and revised by her frequently. The New York operation that she established in 1915 was not her first American presence, but it was the one that defined her American career. She chose the building and the space and the decor with the attention she brought to everything that reflected her brand. The interior was white and modern and clinical in the manner she had established in London and Paris, with the white uniformed operators and the professional consultation atmosphere that distinguished Rubinstein from the rouge and powder orientation of most of her American competitors. She opened with a range of products larger than anything else then available in the American market, and she priced them at the top of that market with complete confidence in the positioning. The American women who came to Rubinstein's salon in 1915 were not all wealthy. They were not all members of the social class the Fifth Avenue address implied. Some of them were, but some of them were women from various backgrounds who decided that this was an expenditure worth making, that the consultation and the product represented an investment in themselves that was justified by the results and the confidence and the sense of being taken seriously that the Rubinstein experience provided. These women talked to each other. The word of mouth that built her American reputation was not solely the recommendation of the socially prominent, though that was useful. It was the recommendation of women who had experienced something that worked and felt compelled to tell someone about it. The question of what Helena Rubinstein thought of her customers is one that does not have a single clean answer. She made statements throughout her career suggesting that she saw the women who bought her products as deserving of the best she could offer, as intelligent people whose trust she was obligated to honour, with real quality and genuine effectiveness. She also made statements suggesting that she understood her customers' desires very well and was expert at constructing products and experiences that delivered the feeling of those desires being fulfilled, which is a different kind of statement. Both things were probably true simultaneously, because she was a person of sufficient complexity to hold both orientations at once without experiencing them as contradictory. The question of Helena Rubinstein's Jewishness is one that her biographers have treated with varying degrees of directness, but it is relevant to the story in ways that go beyond biography. She built her career in an industry that was, for much of the first half of the 20th century, one of the few fields where women, including Jewish women, could achieve positions of real economic and creative authority without encountering the formal exclusions that characterized law, medicine, finance, and most of the other paths to professional prominence. Beauty was not considered serious enough to guard carefully, and the women who built empires in it did so in a space that had been left open partly because it had been dismissed. Helena Rubinstein never dismissed it. She treated her industry as seriously as any physician treated medicine, and she communicated that seriousness through everything she did, from the rigor of her laboratory work to the design of her salon interiors to the precision of her advertising language. She elevated the work by taking it seriously, and by doing so she elevated the professional status of the women who worked in it, the operators and the salesgirls and the product developers, all of whom benefited from being associated with an enterprise that its founder refused to be condescended to about. The private Helena Rubinstein was, by all accounts, considerably less composed than the public one. She was anxious about money in a way that persisted long after there was any rational basis for financial anxiety. She was anxious about her position in a way that did not diminish as her position became more secure. She was warm and generous with people she trusted, and impatient and exacting with people who did not meet her standards, which was a larger category than she sometimes acknowledged. She was, in short, a human being with all the complications that entails, operating at a level of public visibility that left very little room for those complications to be private. The elevator doors open at 8:45 and you step out onto the main floor of the department store into a smell that is entirely its own thing, a combination of floor wax and leather from the handbag department, and the mingled fragrances of a dozen cosmetics lines doing combat in the enclosed air, and your first thought every morning is the same thought you have been having since they moved you to the beauty counter 18 months ago. The smell gets into everything, into your hair, into the fabric of your uniform, into the particular space behind your ears where you applied your own perfume before leaving the house, and which now belongs entirely to Arpege and Chanel No. 5, and the Revlon demonstration fragrance and whatever else has been sprayed within a 5-foot radius of your station today. You are 22. You have been working at this counter since you were 20, when you were hired on the basis that you had good skin and a pleasant manner, and a willingness to learn the product lines, which was the standard hiring criteria for a cosmetic salesgirl in 1962. The supervisor who hired you told you with great seriousness that you were a representative of the products you sold, and that you would be expected to use them, and that the company would provide an employee discount, but that the application of your cosmetics each morning was a professional responsibility, not an optional courtesy. You nodded. You understood. The standards were clearly communicated and have not changed. Your uniform is a white linen jacket with the store's logo embroidered on the breast pocket, worn over a dark skirt of your own choosing, and your appearance is expected to reflect the standard that the cosmetics companies, whose lines you carry, have established for their in-store representatives. This means full makeup, every morning, without exception, including the mornings when you're running late because the bus was early and left without you, which is somehow worse than the bus being late, and the mornings when you're tired in ways that predate the previous night and go back several days, and the mornings in February when the cold makes your nose run and your eyes water, and the mascara situation becomes a problem before you have even reached the store. Full makeup, every day. The counter is laid out in a way that took you 3 weeks to fully learn. The demonstrators along the front edge, the current season's shades facing outward, the testers in their designated spots with the cotton balls beside them in the small silver dish that must be refreshed every morning, because nothing says professional more reliably than a dish of fresh cotton balls, and nothing says otherwise more reliably than a dish of grey used ones. Behind the counter, the stock is arranged by product type and then by brand, and you know where everything is with the confident precision of someone who has been asked for things in a hurry, a great many times, and has learned that hesitation communicates uncertainty, and uncertainty communicates doubt, and doubt sends a woman to the Estee Lauder counter instead. The first customer of the day arrives at 9:15, which is earlier than usual. She's perhaps 50, well dressed in a way that communicates both taste and budget without announcing either, and she approaches the counter with the purposeful but slightly wary expression of a woman who knows what she wants but is not entirely certain she wants to want it. You recognize this expression. It is one of the more common ones. The beauty counter, you have come to understand, is a place where women come with need and sometimes leave with confusion, and your job is to reduce the confusion without ever letting the woman feel that she was confused in the first place. She is looking for a foundation that matches her skin tone, which she describes as medium but not too yellow, and which she says she has not found in any product she has tried so far, and which she bought last from a counter in another store that no longer carries the shade she liked. You listen to all of this without interrupting, because you have learned that the complete presentation of the problem is part of what the customer is purchasing, and that cutting her off to offer solutions before she has finished describing the issue is a shortcut that will cost you the sale and possibly the customer. You nod. You ask a clarifying question, just one, about whether she wears the foundation year-round or only in the summer months when her skin is somewhat more coloured from being outdoors. She looks at you as though this is a more intelligent question than she expected. You pull 3 possible foundations, each one a different formula from a different brand, and you explain the difference between them in plain language that does not require her to know terminology, but also does not condescend to her, because women who come to this counter are not ignorant and they know when they are being talked down to and they remember it. You talk about coverage and finish and staying power and what each formula will do differently in different temperatures and why the one in the centre, the one she's already picking up to look at more closely, is the one you would select for her if you were selecting. She asks if you use it yourself. You say that you do, which is true, and that you find it performs reliably through a full working day, which is also true. She buys the foundation and a pressed powder to go with it, because you mentioned the powder in passing and she made the connection herself. This is the skill of the beauty counter, and it is a real skill, whatever anyone outside it might think about the nature of the work. The ability to listen past the stated request to the actual need. The ability to recommend without pressuring, to suggest the additional item in a way that reads as helpfulness rather than upselling, to make the woman feel that she has been seen and understood by someone who actually knows about what she's buying. It takes time to learn. The women who have been working cosmetics counters for 10 or 15 years can do it so smoothly that it looks effortless, and one of the things you are still working on is the effortlessness. The technical knowledge is solid now, the smoothness is still a work in progress. By mid-morning the counter is busier. Tuesdays are not the most reliably busy days, but the promotions change on Wednesdays, and word has gotten around, as it does, that there is a gift with purchase offer beginning tomorrow, and that certain customers who come in before it officially starts, who ask the right question, who happen to have a good relationship with the girl at the counter, find that the practical administration of promotional start dates has a certain flexibility to it. You're not supposed to give out the gift before Wednesday. You also are not supposed to lose customers to the Revlon counter 3 feet away, because they went over there and received the gift today in an informal preview capacity. You use your judgment. There is a woman who comes in every 2 weeks without fail, and has since before you started, according to the woman who trained you. She buys the same moisturizer every 2 weeks, the same size, the same formula, and she has been doing this for years, which means she goes through it at a rate that is somewhat higher than the recommended usage suggests is necessary, a fact you have never commented on. She comes in at around 11, stays for perhaps 20 minutes, talks to whoever is behind the counter about nothing in particular, and leaves with her moisturizer in its bag. You understood after about the 3rd time that the moisturizer was secondary. The 20 minutes was the product. Whatever was happening at home or not happening at home, or simply the structure of a day that needed an outing in the middle of it, this counter provided something that was not exactly capturable in the transaction. You have learned not to rush her. The lunch hour is the busiest hour. Women on their breaks from offices nearby, women who have parked downtown for a specific errand and are using the remaining time before they have to be back in the car. Women who come in for one thing and whose eyes wander while they wait to be helped and land on something else. This is the hour when you need to be everywhere and unhurried simultaneously, which is a particular kind of physical and mental coordination that takes practice. You learn to read the posture of someone who is waiting versus the posture of someone who is browsing, to make eye contact and hold it for the half second that says, "I know you are there, and I will be with you soon," without the other woman feeling dismissed, to finish one transaction and be oriented toward the next without any visible seam between them. You eat your own lunch standing up, in the back area behind the stockroom door, in the 12 minutes between 1 and 1:12 before the other girl's break is over. You eat the same thing most days, half a sandwich and an apple, because it is portable and requires no refrigeration and can be eaten in the time available. You do not take off your jacket. You do not sit down. You check your lipstick in the small mirror you keep in your uniform pocket before you go back out, because the appearance requirement does not pause for lunch, and because you know that the first customer who comes to the counter after your break will form her first impression in the initial 3 seconds, and 3 seconds is not enough time for incomplete lipstick. The afternoon is different from the morning in a quality that is harder to describe than a simple matter of pace. The morning women are purposeful. The afternoon women are often running on a different kind of energy, one that contains more weariness and sometimes more willingness to spend, as though the decision-making reserve has been somewhat depleted by the day, and the resistance to the beautiful thing on the glass counter is lower than it was at 9:15. This is not a cynical observation. It is simply an accurate one, and accuracy is the foundation of good customer service, the same way it is the foundation of good diagnosis. You have one difficult conversation in the late afternoon. A woman returns something she bought 2 weeks ago, a moisturizer she says did not agree with her skin, and she would like to exchange it for something different. The product she's returning is clearly well used, which is the polite way of saying it is more than half gone, which means the conversation is not actually about a moisturizer that did not agree with her skin. You conduct the exchange with complete professionalism. You ask her about the specific reaction she experienced, because there are skin types that genuinely do not respond well to certain ingredients, and understanding what happened helps you make a better recommendation. Or this is the frame you put around the question. She tells you. You recommend something different. She buys it. You process the return with the appropriate paperwork and a pleasant expression. This interaction will appear in no official record as anything other than a successful customer service moment, which is also an accurate description of what it was. By 4 o'clock, you've been on your feet for 7 hours with the 12-minute break, and the floor is beginning to communicate this to you in the specific vocabulary of feet and the lower back. You do not sit. The counter has no stool. Sitting at the beauty counter was not something that happened in the early 1960s, not because there was an explicit prohibition, but because the standing salesgirl was the standard presentation, and the counter was designed around it, and to sit would have created a visual anomaly that no one had designed for. You stand with the practiced ease of someone who has trained herself, not to shift weight obviously, or to develop the 1,000-yard look of someone enduring discomfort. You present as comfortable. The presentation is part of the job. The end of the day involves a series of tasks that are separate from but as important as the selling itself. The demonstrators are wiped down. The testers are replaced if they have run low. The cotton ball dish is refilled. The stock under the counter is checked against what was sold, and the replenishment forms are filled out in the neat handwriting that the supervisor emphasized was a reflection of the department's professionalism. The display cases are sprayed with a special cleaner and buffed with a soft cloth so that the glass is clear and the lighting inside shows the products at their best. You check the tag on each display item for the current price, because prices change with promotions, and a price tag that does not match what the register rings is a problem that happens to the customer at a moment that cannot be fully recovered from. You take off your white linen jacket and put on your street coat at 5:30. And for a moment before you button the coat, you stand at the back of the counter and look at what you have left behind. The perfectly arranged counter with its demonstrators and testers and fresh cotton balls, the glass cases lit from inside, the neat row of product arranged by brand along the back shelf, and you feel the mild satisfaction of a workday completed to the standard you set for yourself, which is the only standard you have any control over. The bus is at 5:45. You know every traffic pattern on the route by now. You will be home by 6:30 if nothing unusual happens, which is most days. What you know about beauty that you did not know before this job is considerable, and some of it is not the kind of knowledge that appears in the training materials. You know that women come to beauty counters for reasons that are not always or entirely about the products. You know that the salesgirl is a particular kind of trusted stranger, someone who sees the woman up close in the fluorescent light, without pretending not to notice what they are seeing, and who responds with neither judgment nor false flattery, but with genuine practical information, and that this combination is rarer than you might have expected when you started. You know that the routine your mother taught you, and that you now represent professionally for 8 hours a day, is not a small thing in the lives of the women who practice it. You know that the counter you stand behind every day is the place where something passes between generations, where the knowledge comes out of the bathroom and into the bright light of the store floor, where the private ritual meets the commercial transaction, and where something real happens despite and sometimes because of all of that. The training you went through before you were allowed to stand behind the counter alone took 3 weeks, which was considered thorough by the standards of the industry at the time. It covered the product lines you would be representing, which were 3 separate brands with distinct positioning, distinct formulation philosophies, distinct target customers, and distinct commission structures that you were absolutely not supposed to discuss with anyone outside the department. It covered the company's policies on returns, on promotions, on gift with purchase administration, on how to handle a complaint, on what to do if a customer became distressed, and on the correct way to handle a situation in which someone was clearly going to leave without purchasing anything, which your supervisor described as a harvesting opportunity for future relationship rather than a lost sale, a framing that you found both sensible and slightly alarming. The woman who trained you had been behind beauty counters for 11 years and had the particular quality of composure that comes from having seen everything at least twice and having learned that the correct response is almost always some variation of warm, calm and useful. She was 33. She looked younger because she used every product on the counter that she recommended and had done so consistently for years. She wore her foundation precisely matched to her skin tone with no visible line of demarcation, her eyebrows shaped and filled to a standard that your mother would have approved of. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Her lipstick in a shade of rose that she had been wearing since she discovered it 5 years earlier and that she said she would continue wearing until they discontinued it, at which point she would have a conversation with management about acceptable alternatives. She taught you the counter layout in the first hour of the first day, walking you through it with the same attention to sequence and logic that your mother had used to teach you the morning routine. Everything had a place, and the place was not arbitrary. The products a customer was most likely to request first were positioned closest to the customer's natural approach angle. The complementary products, the things you would mention after the primary purchase was established, were arranged to catch the eye during the transaction without being pushy about it. The demonstrators, the open testers that customers could apply themselves with a cotton ball, were cleaned and replenished at the beginning of each shift and again at midday, because a tester that looked used was a tester that told the customer something about how the product behaved that you did not necessarily want communicated before the sale. She taught you about fragrance, which was the counter adjacent to yours and whose dynamics were completely different from cosmetics. Fragrance customers, she explained, were often in a different emotional state than foundation customers. They were frequently buying a gift or buying something for an occasion, and they approached the counter with a combination of purpose and vulnerability that required a different kind of handling. You were not supposed to spray fragrance on a customer without asking. You were not supposed to spray more than 2 or 3 on any given customer, because the nose loses its ability to distinguish after the third, and a customer who cannot distinguish is a customer who cannot commit to a purchase. This seems like obvious information now. At 20, it was revelatory. The holiday season was its own country, and you entered it in late October and did not fully exit it until January. The pace changed in ways that were not simply faster, but qualitatively different. The way a run is qualitatively different from a walk, rather than simply a faster version of it. The gift sets appeared, the special holiday packaging with its foils and ribbons, and the customers who came to the counter in November and December were often operating under a particular kind of stress that had nothing to do with the beauty products themselves. They were buying gifts for mothers and mothers-in-law and sisters and friends and co-workers, and they were buying them within budgets that were sometimes stated and sometimes had to be inferred, and they were buying them with a deadline attached that was non-negotiable, and a recipient's taste that was not always fully understood. You became adept at the gift consultation. It was a skill unto itself, distinct from the standard counter work, because in the gift consultation, you were essentially profiling an absent third party based on the fragments of information the present customer could offer. You asked questions about the recipient's age and her usual habits, and whether she had sensitivities to fragrance, and about what had been purchased before and how it had been received. You asked about her colouring in a general way, light or dark skin, light or dark hair, because some product lines simply suited certain colourings more than others, and you were trying to eliminate the probability of a mismatch. You asked whether she was someone who liked the classic or whether she was open to something newer, because this told you something important about the gap between what the customer wanted to give and what the recipient would enjoy. The most difficult gift consultations involved husbands buying for their wives. These came in at a fairly steady rate throughout November and December, and were sometimes straightforward and sometimes not at all. The straightforward ones involved husbands who came in with either a list or an empty bottle, both of which gave you everything you needed. The less straightforward ones involved husbands who came in with good intentions and no specific information, and a budget they were not always comfortable disclosing directly, and who needed to be guided towards something appropriate without being made to feel that the guidance was necessary. You learned to ask the useful questions in a way that felt like conversation rather than intake. to take the information offered and use it without appearing to use it, to arrive at a recommendation that felt like inspiration rather than elimination. There were days when the work was genuinely pleasurable in a way that had nothing to do with the commission. Days when the woman who came to the counter was someone you could really help, someone whose skin concern was real and whose budget allowed a real solution, and who was receptive to information presented well, and who left with something that would actually make a difference to her morning routine. These customers were the reason you stayed. They came in looking for something and left having found it. Not merely the product, but the knowledge that went with it, the application technique, the order of use, the understanding of what to expect and when. This was the work at its best, and it happened often enough to sustain the commitment through the days when it was not at its best. There were also the returns. Returns were not frequent, but they were instructive in the way that all exceptions are instructive. The woman who returned an eyeshadow because it creased after 2 hours had a question about application technique embedded in the complaint, and addressing the question directly was more useful to her and more honest than processing the return without comment. The woman who returned a fragrance because it smelled different on her than it did on the demonstrator strip was encountering the basic chemistry of skin pH, which affects fragrance performance in ways that strip testing does not predict, and understanding this would save her future frustration and future returns. You tried to turn returns into education when the opportunity existed, because knowledge retained is a better outcome for everyone than a transaction reversed. What the counter taught you about women was something that your mother had intuited and your training had gestured toward, but that the actual daily practice produced in its full specificity. Women came to beauty counters carrying the weight of their own standards, not the standards of the advertisement, though those existed in the background, but their own specific internalized version of what they were supposed to look like and what they currently did look like, and the distance between those two things. Your job was to help reduce that distance where you could, and to be honest about where the distance was irreducible, not because the woman should give up, but because unrealistic expectations produce dissatisfied customers who blame the product when the product has done exactly what the product was designed to do. The particular pressure of appearing at your best for 8 consecutive hours, 5 days a week, was not something the recruitment process had emphasized, but it was the defining physical and psychological demand of the job. You arrived fully made up, and you remained fully made up throughout the day, which meant the 2 o'clock lipstick check and the 3 o'clock powder refresh and the constant low-level monitoring of your own appearance against the standard you were expected to represent. This was not paranoia, it was professional responsibility. You were the demonstration. If the products you were selling could not maintain themselves on the face of the person selling them, the customer noticed, and the customer drew the appropriate conclusion. The fluorescent light above the counter was the great equalizer and the great revealer. Under fluorescent light, everything was visible. Every unblended edge, every shade that was not quite right, every product that was not performing as advertised. The women who trained you understood that the counterlight was the harshest possible working environment for the cosmetics they were selling, and that surviving it was itself a form of endorsement. If your foundation looked good under the overhead fluorescence at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, it looked good. There was no more rigorous test available. By the time you'd been at the counter for 2 years, you had developed a particular quality of attention that was not exactly empathy, and not exactly analysis, but something in between. A kind of calibrated noticing that allowed you to read what a woman needed before she said it, to meet her at her actual starting point rather than the starting point the training materials assumed, and to find the route from where she was to what would genuinely serve her. This quality was not something that could be taught directly. It came from the accumulation of hundreds of consultations, from the patterns that emerged from that accumulation, and from the willingness to take the work seriously enough to let it teach you something. The beauty counter in the early 1960s was a specific kind of institution, a place where the domestic and the commercial met in the person of the salesgirl, who was simultaneously a product representative and a practical advisor and a human being with aching feet and a lipstick that needed refreshing. It was a place where the knowledge that women passed to each other in bathrooms and at kitchen tables met the knowledge that laboratories and marketing departments had packaged into commercial formulations, and where the translation between those two kinds of knowing happened in real time, in conversation, under fluorescent light, for a salary that did not come close to reflecting the skill it required. You stayed because the work was real. You stayed because the women you helped were real. You stayed because learning what you were learning behind that counter was not something any other job you could imagine would teach you, and you were 22 and curious and not yet finished finding out what you were capable of. The commission structure at the beauty counter was not discussed openly among the salesgirls, but it was understood by everyone who worked there. Different brands paid different commission rates, which created a subtle but real tension between the genuine needs of the customer standing in front of you and the economic logic of your own paycheck. You were not supposed to recommend the higher commission product when the lower commission product better served the customer's needs. You were not supposed to, and you were also not oblivious to which direction the incentive pointed. Most of the women you worked with resolved this tension by recommending what they genuinely believed was best and accepting the commission that resulted, which was also the approach most compatible with the long-term relationship that repeat customers required. Repeat customers were the foundation of the counter's stable revenue. The women who came back every month for the same product, who asked for you specifically when they came in, who sent their daughters and their friends and their neighbours with a recommendation, were the customers around whom the practical economics of counterwork were organised. A salesperson with a strong book of repeat customers had a predictability to her sales that was valuable to management and was, informally, a form of job security. You built that book through the same thing that built everything worth building at the counter, listening carefully and recommending honestly, and following up when the opportunity presented itself. The question of skin colour in the beauty counter in the early 1960s is one that the historical record handles with a delicacy that can obscure what was actually happening. Department stores in the North were not legally segregated in the way that department stores in the South were in this period, but they were often functionally segregated in ways that were maintained through social convention and managerial discretion rather than written policy. Black women who came to beauty counters in many northern stores encountered varying qualities of service, ranging from the professional and courteous to the dismissive and occasionally the hostile, depending on the store and the staff and the particular moment. The beauty product lines available to black women in mainstream department stores were limited in ways that reflected the assumptions of the industry about who the beauty market primarily served. Foundation shades ran from very light to what was described as medium in a range that did not extend to the full spectrum of skin tones actually present in the American population. The products that existed for darker skin tones were largely available through different distribution channels, through beauty supply stores, and through companies that had been established specifically to serve black consumers, companies that the mainstream beauty counter was not stocking. This was a gap in the market that some people understood as discrimination, and others understood as business logic, and the distinction between those two framings was less clear than either side generally acknowledged. The perfume demonstrations that you conducted at the counter required a different kind of performance than the skincare or colour consultations. Fragrance was more intimate in its physical dimensions and more personal in its psychological ones, because fragrance was not merely a cosmetic applied to a surface, but a chemical interaction with the body that produced a result unique to the individual wearing it. You had learned to explain this in plain language that communicated the scientific reality without making the customer feel that the fragrance she had just tested on her wrist was performing inadequately. The way a fragrance smells on a strip of paper and the way it smells on skin are simply different, you would explain, because of the skin's warmth and its own particular chemistry, and neither version is wrong. They are just different experiences of the same fragrance. The cosmetics counter also sold something that was nowhere on any inventory list, and that could not be tracked by any commission structure. The experience of being seen and addressed as a person capable of making informed decisions about her own appearance. This sounds like a small thing, until you consider the specific moment in American women's history that the early 1960s represented. A moment when women were beginning to understand in new ways the gap between the decisions that were theoretically theirs and the structures that shaped those decisions, and the beauty counter was one of the spaces where that gap was either honoured or closed, depending on the quality of the person behind it. The salesgirl who gave a woman real information and genuine respect for her ability to use it was doing something that mattered beyond the transaction. There were moments at the counter that stayed with you in the way that small, complete things stay with you. The woman who came in on a Tuesday in November, not a special occasion, not a holiday, just a Tuesday, and who spent 40 minutes going through the lipstick range with you and told you while she was doing it that she was going back to work for the first time since her children were born, and that she wanted to feel like herself again, and that the lipstick was part of that. Just part of it. You helped her find the right shade, which was a warm rose that she said was the colour she had worn before she stopped working, and when she found it, and looked in the counter mirror, and saw what it did to the whole composition of her face, she put her hand up to her mouth in a gesture that was not about the lipstick at all. These were the moments the training did not cover, and that experience taught you to be present for. The invisible labour of the beauty counter extended beyond the counter itself and into the ways you carried the work home with you. Not the physical tiredness alone, but the particular attentiveness that counter work required, and that did not simply switch off at 5:30 when you left the floor. You found yourself noticing skin in ways you had not before you started this work, noticing the undertones in a friend's complexion that suggested she might do better with a different foundation shade, noticing the texture that suggested dehydration, or the quality of brow shaping that was slightly off from what would suit the face. This noticing was not always welcome in social situations, and you learned to keep most of it to yourself. The relationship between the beauty counter and the women's movement that was beginning to gather momentum in the early 1960s is one that the movement itself did not always frame with nuance. The critique was that the beauty industry was a tool of oppression, that the standards it enforced were patriarchal constructions designed to keep women focused on their surfaces rather than their capacities, that the time and money and psychological energy invested in cosmetics was a form of false consciousness that served the interests of a consumer economy, and not the interests of the women consuming. This critique had real substance. It also did not do complete justice to the complexity of what was actually happening at the counter and in the lives of the women who came to it. For many women, the beauty routine was not a capitulation to external demands, but a genuine form of self-expression and self-possession within the limited spaces available for such things. The choice of a particular lipstick shade, the mastery of a particular technique, the satisfaction of a well-executed set that lasted through the day, these were real pleasures and real competencies, and the women who held them were not confused about their own interests. They were navigating the available options with the intelligence and pragmatism that has always characterized the actual practice of human lives inside structural constraints. The advertisements were beautiful. You have to give them that. The women in the cosmetics advertisements of the 1940s and 50s and 60s were extraordinary creatures, photographed in soft light with impeccable skin and serene expressions and a quality of completion that suggested they had never been uncertain, never been tired, never encountered a morning when the routine did not yield the promised result. They held their products with the gentle confidence of someone displaying something precious. They looked directly at you, or at something just past you, with an expression that said this could be yours too, not as a threat but as an invitation, warm and completely sincere. The advertisements did not show what was in the products. This was not an accident. It was a feature. In the early 1960s, the cosmetics industry in the United States was operating under regulatory conditions that would astonish the modern consumer, not because the regulations were new, but because the gaps in them were substantial and deliberate, and had been maintained through the concerted effort of an industry that understood exactly what it stood to lose if the contents of its formulations were subjected to the same scrutiny that the claims on its packaging were not, in any serious way, subjected to either. The Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938 had given the FDA authority over cosmetics, but the authority was limited in specific ways that made it less powerful than it sounded. The FDA could act if a product caused demonstrable harm. It could not require companies to test products for safety before selling them. It could not require companies to disclose their ingredients. It could not require evidence that the claims on the label reflected anything chemically real. A cosmetics company in 1960 could put almost anything in a jar and call it almost anything, as long as no one could prove the jar had sent anyone to the hospital. What was in the jars was often, by modern standards, startling. Lead acetate appeared in hair dyes as a colour agent, and had appeared in them for decades, and was not removed from the approved list until 1980. Mercury compounds appeared in skin-lightening creams and in certain mascaras as preservatives. They appeared in products sold specifically for complexion improvement, which was the category that absorbed the most aspirational marketing, and therefore the most trust. Mercury compounds were not disclosed. They were simply present, doing what they did to the skin and to the body, quietly and without announcement. Formaldehyde appeared in nail hardeners and in certain hair products, and was present in the preservative systems of a wide range of skincare formulations because it was effective and inexpensive, and no one was required to print it on the label. Coal tar dyes appeared in hair colouring and in certain lipstick formulations, some of which were associated with skin sensitization and allergic reactions. Coal tar dyes were a known concern within the industry by the 1950s. They appeared in products throughout the 60s because their removal would have required either reformulation or disclosure, and neither option was attractive. Asbestos appeared in talcum powder, which is perhaps the most troubling item on a troubling list. Talc and asbestos are geologically associated minerals, meaning they occur in proximity in natural deposits and can be extracted together if the mining and processing standards are not rigorous. In the 1960s, the standards were not consistently rigorous, which meant that the talcum powder being applied to skin and to infants in quantities that were effectively unlimited, that was sprinkled onto countertops and into gloves, and used as a general-purpose drying and smoothing agent across a wide range of applications, sometimes contained asbestos fibres. This was known in the sense that geologists knew it. It was not known in the sense that the woman using the powder to set her foundation every morning knew it. The information did not travel between those two categories of knowledge. The skin lightening industry deserves particular attention, not because its practices were unique, but because they illustrate more clearly than almost anything else the distance between the beauty ideal being sold and the safety of the products being used to pursue it. Mercury compounds were the active ingredient in numerous skin lightening and spot fading preparations, sold under names that communicated effectiveness and elegance and a certain kind of scientific authority. Ammoniated mercury was a common formulation. It lightened skin through a mechanism that is essentially toxic, suppressing melanin production in ways that have consequences for the kidneys and the nervous system with prolonged use. Women used these products for years on their faces daily because the products worked in the sense that they produced the visible result they promised, and because no one was required to tell them what else they were doing. The lead in hair dye is a somewhat different story because the lead was not an impurity or an undisclosed additive. Lead acetate was a known, intentional ingredient in progressive hair dye formulations, meaning the kind of hair colour that works by gradual exposure rather than by a single application. It was used because it produced a natural-looking gradual darkening that was appealing to consumers who found the abruptness of traditional hair colour artificial. It worked as advertised. It also deposited lead on the scalp and on the hands and on any surface the treated hair touched over repeated applications for the duration of the product's use, which could be years or decades. The lead was in the formulation from the beginning. It remained in the formulation for decades after the safety concerns became known within regulatory circles, because the standard for removal was harm demonstrably linked to the specific product, and building that evidentiary chain took time and resources that advocacy for any single consumer was unlikely to be able to supply. There is a particular quality to the social pressure that maintained beauty standards in the early 1960s that is worth examining carefully, because it was not only commercial. The advertising was the visible surface of something that ran deeper and was harder to name, a set of expectations about female appearance that were not just preferences but requirements, communicated through social relationships and workplace norms, and the specific cultural shorthand of a society that was extremely articulate about what a woman who cared about herself looked like, and extremely vague about what was being asked of her in pursuit of that appearance. A woman who did not wear makeup to work in an office environment in 1962 was not making a personal style choice. She was making a statement that most employers would not have characterized as acceptable, not because there was a written policy in most cases, but because the expectation was so thoroughly embedded that stating it would have felt as strange as stating that one was expected to wear shoes. The women who worked for Helena Rubinstein, and the women who worked in department store beauty departments, and the women who worked in virtually every white-collar office environment in the country, understood that their professional presentation included a cosmetics routine, and that departing from it significantly was a form of workplace deviance that would be registered even if no one articulated why. The weight of the girdle deserves its own consideration, partly because it is literal and partly because it is not. The foundation garments that were considered standard in the early 1960s The girdles and garter belts and long-line bras and combination undergarments that were sold in the foundations department of the same store where the beauty counter lived were not optional accessories. They were the invisible infrastructure of the appearance that the visible products were meant to complete. A woman who was not wearing a girdle in a context where girdles were expected was detectable, in the vocabulary of the era, as someone who was letting herself go. A phrase whose weight and menace were considerable. Letting yourself go was not only an aesthetic judgment, it was a social one, a judgment about character and effort and self-respect, and it was applied to women with a thoroughness that had no male equivalent. The beauty secrets that women passed from mother to daughter in the early 1960s were real and mostly harmless. The witch hazel toner and the cold cream and the pin curls and the eyebrow pencil held one shade darker than your natural hair, and the ring finger used for the most delicate skin. All of this was practical knowledge, accumulated wisdom, genuinely useful. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. But it existed inside a system whose demands were not limited to practical wisdom. A system that also included the mercury in the complexion cream, and the lead in the hair dye, and the social consequences of insufficient effort, and the beauty standards set by an advertising industry that was not primarily interested in the health or comfort of the women it was addressing. The women who inherited these routines from their mothers did not always inherit the full picture. They inherited the practices which were genuinely useful. They inherited the products, some of which were not. And they inherited the expectation itself, the belief that this attention to appearance was simply the correct way for a woman to move through the world, unquestioned and therefore unquestionable. Questioning it would have required a framework that most women did not have available to them in 1962, not because they were not intelligent enough to construct one, but because the culture they were living inside had not yet supplied the vocabulary for it. The vocabulary began to arrive in the mid to late 1960s, slowly, imperfectly, incompletely, with all the complications that attend the arrival of new ways of seeing old arrangements. Some women put down the mascara as a gesture of rejection. Others kept applying it as a gesture of pleasure, because whatever the system around it demanded, the mascara itself was theirs, a small daily act of self-construction that they had not chosen to give up just because someone was now suggesting it had been assigned to them from outside. Both responses were reasonable. Both were being carried out by women who had been given inadequate information about the products they were using and the system they were operating inside, and who were doing the best they could with the tools available to them. The beauty industry began to change not because it wanted to, but because the regulatory environment slowly began to catch up. Ingredient disclosure requirements arrived in 1977, when the FDA mandated that cosmetics list their ingredients on the label, a requirement the industry fought with considerable energy and lost with considerable reluctance. Some of the most problematic ingredients were phased out over the following decades, some voluntarily, and some because the evidence for harm had finally become too clear to maintain in the face of regulatory pressure. Lead acetate stayed in progressive hair dye until 1980. Mercury compounds in skin-lightening preparations proved harder to remove because the products migrated to markets with less regulatory oversight and remained available in some of those markets for much longer than the domestic timeline would suggest. What the beauty counter salesgirl knew in 1962, and what the woman in front of her bathroom mirror knew, and what Helena Rubinstein knew when she formulated her cold creams, and what every woman who passed a beauty secret from one generation to the next was working with, was an incomplete picture. Not because they were uninformed people, but because the information had not been made available to them, by design and by legal structure, and by the simple fact that an industry selling aspiration has limited interest in the complete disclosure of the materials with which it is selling it. The routines were real, the knowledge was real, the care and the effort and the pride and the community of women teaching each other what they knew were all real. The picture around all of it was incomplete in ways that mattered. To understand the gap between the beauty industry's official image and its underlying reality in the 1960s, it helps to start with the advertising, not the specific claims, but the broader visual and emotional grammar of it. The way the advertisements constructed a world in which a woman's relationship to her own appearance was a form of virtue. The woman in the advertisement was not simply attractive, she was doing something right. The cream she was holding was the physical evidence of her correct priorities. Her skin was the reward for her discipline and attention. The implicit logic was circular and effective. Good skin meant good effort. Good effort meant good character. Good character deserved good skin. To neglect the routine was to fail at something more fundamental than beauty. This logic had deep roots in American culture that predated the cosmetics industry. The idea that a woman's appearance was a measure of her character, that a well-kept exterior signalled an orderly interior, that the maintenance of one's looks was a form of domestic and moral duty rather than a personal preference, was present in conduct literature and household advice well before any advertising existed to reinforce it. The cosmetics industry did not invent this idea. It simply recognised the idea, packaged it, and sold product into the space the idea created. When Helena Rubinstein said that every woman deserved good skin, she was speaking into a culture that already believed that every woman who was paying attention had good skin, and the two beliefs together created an extremely powerful commercial environment. The home remedies that existed before commercial beauty products were not in most cases less safe than what replaced them. This is one of the more quietly interesting reversals in the history of American beauty culture. The cold cream formulations of the pre-commercial era, made from ingredients that had been in use for centuries, from beeswax and rose water and almond oil, and similar simple components, were chemically stable and generally innocuous. The commercial formulations that replaced or supplemented them were sometimes simpler and safer, and sometimes considerably more complex and less so, depending on the manufacturer and the era and the regulatory environment at the time. The shift from homemade to commercially manufactured beauty products was not uniformly a shift toward better chemistry. Hair dye occupies a specific place in the history of beauty product safety, and not an entirely comfortable one. The desire to cover grey hair is ancient, and the methods women used before commercial hair colour arrived in the early 20th century range from herbal rinses of varying effectiveness to preparations involving lead compounds that were known to be toxic by the Romans, who used them anyway, and continued to be used in various forms through centuries of beauty practice with the practical knowledge that they worked on the hair and the incomplete knowledge of what they did elsewhere in the body. The first modern synthetic hair dyes arrived in the late 19th century, derived from coal tar chemistry, and brought with them a new set of concerns. Paraphenylenediamine, commonly known by its abbreviation, became the workhorse of the permanent hair colour industry and remains in use today. It is a known sensitizer, meaning that prolonged or repeated exposure can cause the immune system to develop a reaction, and that the reaction, once developed, is permanent. A woman who became sensitized to the compound could not use permanent hair colour again, without risking a significant allergic response. This was not a secret within the industry. It was known by the 1930s. The warning on the package, the skin test recommendation applied 24 to 48 hours before application, was a direct acknowledgement of this risk. But the warning was there, which is different from the warning being followed, and the evidence suggests that most women perform the skin test approximately as often as they read the instruction manual for a new appliance. The relationship between talcum powder and asbestos was one of the most consequential safety issues in 20th century cosmetics, and it was one of the slowest to be addressed. Talcum powder was one of the most widely used products in the American home by the 1960s, used on babies, on adults, on feet, underarms, inside gloves, between sheets and clothing and skin wherever dryness and smoothness were desired. It was considered the safest of products, the most benign of all cosmetics, the one thing you could put on an infant without a second thought, and that widespread assumption of safety made the question of what it actually contained less urgent than it might otherwise have been. Talc is a mineral, asbestos is a group of minerals. They share geological space in certain deposits, and when talc is mined without careful separation from its mineral neighbours, the talc can carry asbestos fibres along with it. The health consequences of asbestos fibre inhalation were becoming clearer through the 1950s and 60s, primarily through research on industrial workers exposed to asbestos in manufacturing environments. The connection between cosmetic talc and asbestos contamination was a slower and more contested scientific development, partly because cosmetic exposure is different in character from industrial exposure, and partly because the industry had strong commercial incentives to contest the connection with considerable energy, which it did. The women who applied talcum powder to their faces and their bodies and their children every morning in the 1960s were not reckless. They were using a product that had been marketed to them as the safest thing available, by an industry that knew there were questions about its sourcing and composition and was not eager to answer those questions in public. The regulatory framework did not require answers. The market did not demand them. The women who were eventually harmed by what was in some of those jars had no way of knowing that the harm was occurring, because the information was not available to them through any channel they had access to. The skin lightening market was a particular form of the general problem, and it was a market that operated with an additional dimension of social pressure that went beyond the general expectation of groomed appearance. The ideal skin tone being sold in the beauty market of the 1940s and 50s was not simply smooth and clear. It was white, or as close to white as could be achieved, and the products marketed to lighten, fade, or even out skin tone were selling proximity to that ideal as a form of beauty, and, by the implicit logic of the advertising, as a form of social respectability. Women of many backgrounds purchase skin-lightening products for many reasons, some having nothing to do with racial aspiration and some having everything to do with it. Mercury compounds were not the only problematic ingredient in the skin-lightening category, but they were the most effective at producing rapid visible results, which made them the most commercially valuable. Ammoniated mercury suppressed melanin production through cellular disruption that was, in any accurate description, a kind of localized toxicity. The skin lightened because the cells responsible for its color were being damaged. The lightening worked. Women saw the results and continued using the products because the results were what had been promised, and the mechanism by which the results were achieved was not disclosed on the label or in the advertising or in any communication the average consumer was likely to encounter. The systemic effects of mercury absorption through the skin were documented in medical literature by the 1950s. Cases of kidney damage and neurological symptoms associated with the use of mercury-containing cosmetics were reported in the medical press with enough frequency that the pattern was observable to anyone reading in that specific literature. The literature was read by physicians and by regulatory officials and by some people in the cosmetics industry. It was not read by the women applying the products to their faces every morning, because there was no mechanism for that information to travel from the medical literature to the bathroom shelf. The gap between the knowledge that existed and the knowledge available to consumers was one of the defining features of the regulatory landscape of the era. The girdle culture of the period deserves more sustained attention than it usually receives in discussions of post-war beauty standards, because the girdle was not simply a cosmetic product. It was a structural demand made of the female body, a requirement that the body present itself in a specific silhouette that it did not naturally maintained continuously throughout the waking day, in exchange for the social approval that was effectively contingent on that silhouette. The women who wore girdles were not wearing them because they found them comfortable. They were wearing them because not wearing them was a different kind of discomfort, the social kind, the kind that had professional and interpersonal consequences. The health implications of prolonged compression garments were understood in a general way by the medical community of the 1950s and 60s, and were regularly discussed in women's magazines in a register that managed to both acknowledge the discomfort and reinforce the necessity. Articles explained that the girdle helped with posture, that it provided support, that certain women with certain physical characteristics really ought to be wearing one for their own comfort and health. The logic was circular in a way that was characteristic of much beauty advice of the period. The product that created the problem was also presented as the solution to the problem, and the reader was supposed to conclude from this that the product was necessary. The post-war beauty economy was built on a specific emotional substrate, and that substrate was anxiety. Not crass fear of disapproval, though that was present, but the more interesting anxiety of a generation of women navigating the tension between the gleaming promises of the post-war consumer economy and the persistent realities of female existence that the consumer economy was not quite solving. The women who watched the advertisements and bought the products and performed the routines and passed the knowledge to their daughters were living inside that tension daily, and the beauty routine was one of the ways they navigated it, a practice that offered the genuine satisfactions of skill and care and attention inside a system that was selling the satisfaction in order to profit from it. The inherited beauty secrets were, in the end, a mixed inheritance. The techniques, most of them, were genuinely useful, accumulated practical wisdom that had survived because it worked. The products were more complicated, some of them entirely safe, some of them less so, and most of them somewhere in between, with risks that were either unknown or undisclosed or both. The social framework in which the practices existed was the most complicated element of all, a framework that offered women genuine community and competence and daily pleasure and the satisfaction of expertise, while simultaneously enforcing conformity to standards that were not entirely their own and were maintained partly through mechanisms of anxiety and social consequence that the beauty industry understood and worked with deliberately. The beauty pageant culture that ran parallel to the commercial beauty industry in the post-war era is worth examining as a kind of concentrated expression of the standards the broader culture was enforcing in more diffuse and deniable ways. Beauty pageants made explicit what was everywhere implicit, that female appearance was a public good to be evaluated by objective criteria applied by qualified judges, that there was a correct version of female beauty that could be identified and awarded, and that the pursuit of that version was a legitimate civic activity. The Miss America contest, which by the 1950s was one of the most watched television events in the country, was not simply entertainment. It was a public statement about what the ideal American woman looked like, and the ideal it presented was quite specific in its requirements. The high school home economics curriculum of the 1950s and 60s included grooming and personal appearance as a serious subject of instruction, and this is one of the more revealing documents of what the era considered appropriate feminine education. Students in home economics classes were taught about skincare, about appropriate makeup application for different occasions, about the correct way to maintain their hair and their clothing, and their overall presentation. They were graded on these skills. Their capacity to present themselves correctly was treated as an academic achievement, alongside cooking and sewing and budgeting, all of which were also covered in the curriculum that prepared young women for the lives the culture expected them to lead. The soap opera actress and the movie star served as the primary visual aspirational figures for the beauty market through most of the 1950s and 60s, and the cosmetics industry understood this and used it with great sophistication. Celebrity endorsements were not a new idea in this period, but the scale and the specificity with which they were deployed was. Every major cosmetics brand was associated with at least one prominent actress whose face appeared in the advertising and whose name appeared on the product, and the association was not incidental. Women buying a particular lipstick were not just buying a lipstick, they were participating in a connection to a kind of life the actress represented, and the cosmetics company was selling access to that connection as much as it was selling the lipstick itself. The drugstore beauty section in the 1960s was a democratic counterpart to the department store beauty counter, accessible to women who could not or did not want to pay department store prices, and populated with products that varied widely in quality and safety in ways that the packaging did not always reliably indicate. Revlon and Maybelline and Max Factor were the major players in the mass market, and they competed vigorously on advertising and packaging and promotional pricing in ways that made the consumer choice feel like abundance and freedom, rather than a navigation through an unregulated landscape. The drugstore beauty section was, for many women, where the inherited beauty secrets met the commercial formulation in its most accessible form. The industry's response to growing awareness of safety issues in the 1960s was largely defensive, and the defense was mounted on two fronts simultaneously. On the regulatory front, the industry lobbied consistently and effectively against expanded disclosure requirements and against the kind of pre-market safety testing that the pharmaceutical industry had been subjected to since the thalidomide crisis of the early 1960s. The argument was that cosmetics were not drugs and should not be regulated as drugs, which was technically true and practically very convenient. On the public relations front, the industry invested heavily in the narrative of the rigorously tested, scientifically formulated modern cosmetic that was the safest and most effective product ever offered to the American consumer, a narrative that was partially true and that was presented in a way that made questioning it seem like unnecessary and ungrateful skepticism. The women who began reading the ingredient lists on their cosmetics packages in the late 1970s, after the disclosure requirement finally arrived, were encountering information they had not previously been able to access in any convenient form. Some of them found the information alarming, some of them found it simply bewildering, a long list of chemical names that communicated nothing to someone without a chemistry background. Some of them continued using the same products because the ingredients, whatever they were the ingredients in the products they had been using for years, and they were not dead yet. which is not exactly the standard of safety evaluation that the FDA would endorse, but which is the safety evaluation that most people perform most of the time on most products. The persistence of certain beauty practices from one generation to the next, despite changed circumstances and changed product availability and changed social expectations, is one of the more interesting features of beauty culture across the 20th century. Cold cream survived the introduction of 100 more sophisticated cleansing products because the women who'd been taught to use it had been taught to use it by their mothers, and the teaching came with a conviction about its effectiveness that marketing copy could not easily displace. The ring finger technique persisted because it was taught with a physiological rationale that felt correct and that women passed on with the same conviction. The direction of application, upward and outward, persisted because the women who taught it had seen it work and had no reason to question the mechanism. The beauty secrets that survived the passage of generations were the ones that had practical merit. Not all of them did. Some of the advice passed down from mothers to daughters was based on theories that did not reflect the actual chemistry involved, on correlations that were not causations, on practices that felt effective and were not. But the persistence of the useful ones is its own endorsement of the transmission system. Women who taught their daughters what they knew were teaching from experience, and experience, while not infallible, produces a kind of selection for what actually works over time that is not nothing. The cold cream that your grandmother used and your mother used and you use is still available in formulations that have not changed substantially in decades, because the formulation works, and because the women who know it works keep teaching each other that it works. The transformation of beauty culture in the years after the period we have been discussing was not a simple progression from worse to better, from dangerous to safe, from oppressive to liberating. It was a more complicated negotiation, in which some ingredients were removed and replaced with others whose long-term safety profile was not yet fully understood, in which some social requirements were relaxed and others were intensified or reframed, in which the language of empowerment was adopted by the same commercial structures that had previously used the language of duty. The cosmetics industry did not become a different kind of institution when the women's movement critiqued it. It adapted its vocabulary and maintained its fundamental orientation, which was the sale of aspiration in the form of product. What changed more genuinely was the disclosure. The requirement to list ingredients on the label, modest as it was in its immediate effects, established the principle that the consumer had a right to know what she was applying to her face, a principle that had not previously been recognized in any binding legal form. This principle expanded over the following decades, and the expansion produced a consumer culture around cosmetics that was meaningfully different from the one that had preceded it. Women in the 1980s and 90s were still buying the same kinds of products their mothers had bought, still inheriting routines from their mothers, still passing them forward, but they were doing so with access to information about what was in the products that their mothers and grandmothers had not had, and that information changed the nature of the choice even when it did not change the choice itself. There is a category of beauty product that existed throughout this entire period, from the 1930s through the 70s, that never appeared in the department store beauty counter's glossy presentations, and was never photographed for a magazine advertisement, and was nevertheless one of the most widely used categories of product in American households. These were the home remedies, the kitchen and garden and drugstore preparations that women applied to their faces and their hair not because any company had told them to, but because their mothers or grandmothers or neighbours had told them to, and because the results were visible enough to sustain the practice. Raw egg whites for tightening the pores, mayonnaise as a hair conditioner, petroleum jelly around the eyes, cold tea bags for dark circles, oatmeal paste for inflamed skin, apple cider vinegar as a toner, castor oil for the lashes. These preparations coexisted with the commercial products without any particular sense of contradiction, because the women who used them were not ideologically committed to either the commercial or the homemade. They used what worked. The cold cream from the drugstore worked. The egg white tightened the skin temporarily in a way you could feel and see. The tea bags reduced the puffiness in a way that was genuinely measurable. The castor oil made the lashes appear fuller over time. These things were not miracles. They were chemistry, acting predictably on biological material, and the women who had observed the results over years of practice were performing a kind of empirical science that did not require a laboratory or a credential to produce real knowledge. The inherited beauty secrets, in their fullest sense, included these preparations alongside the Revlon compacts and the Helena Rubinstein cold cream, and the setting lotion in its bottle on the bathroom shelf. We began this evening in a bathroom before sunrise, watching a woman assemble herself in the yellow light above a mirror, following a routine that belonged to her and also to her mother and to her mother's mother, all the way back through the line of mornings too numerous to count. We watched her apply cold cream with her ring finger, because the ring finger applies the least pressure, and we understood that this small specific knowledge carried its way down the years intact, unchanged, genuinely useful. We understood something about the quality of knowledge that gets passed between women in private, in small rooms, in the particular education that happens not in classrooms but at dressing tables and bathroom sinks. We spent time with Helena Rubinstein, who understood before almost anyone else that the private knowledge women carried about their own faces could be organised and credentialed and sold back to them at a profit, and who did this with a combination of genuine scientific curiosity, relentless ambition, and a complicated relationship with the word luxury that she never fully resolved. She built something enormous. She built it in the space between what women had always known and what the modern age was beginning to offer them. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. And she occupied that space with complete authority for 60 years. We stood behind a beauty counter in the early 1960s, and we discovered what a particular kind of skilled labour looks like from the inside. The labour of careful listening and tactful recommendation, and maintaining the presentation through a full 8 hours on a floor that provides no stool and very few natural breaks. We understood that the woman on the other side of the counter was not always buying what she said she was buying, and that the salesgirl's ability to understand what was actually being sought was the real product on offer, wrapped around the moisturiser in its white box. And we looked behind the gleaming official image at the things the advertisements did not show, the ingredients without names on the label, the social expectations enforced with the force of workplace policy without the courtesy of being written down anywhere. We looked at all of this without pretending it was not there, and without allowing it to erase what was real and genuine in the daily practice of women caring for themselves and teaching each other what they knew. Because the cold cream was real, the ring finger technique was real, the pin curls set the night before and released in the morning were real, and the satisfaction of a set that held through the day was a real satisfaction belonging entirely to the woman who had done the work to produce it. The beauty secrets passed between generations were not invented by advertising, even if advertising later colonized and monetized the territory. They were part of how women talked to each other about what it meant to inhabit a body and present it to the world with intention and care, and that conversation had been happening long before any of the brands existed. The women who performed these routines every morning in the early 1960s were doing something that was simultaneously personal and political, domestic and professional, inherited and improvised. They were working within a system that made significant demands and offered incomplete information. They were also, within that system, building something that was theirs, a daily practice of attention and skill that connected them to the women who had taught them, and to the women they would eventually teach in turn. The routine was a form of inheritance, and a form of expression, and a form of continuity, and if it was also a form of compliance, well, most of the things women did in that era were all of those things at once. Somewhere, in a bathroom that no longer exists in a house that was probably torn down some time ago, a woman is standing in yellow light pressing a sheet of tissue paper against her face to set the foundation before she goes down to the kitchen where the coffee is ready. She is tired. She was up too early. The day ahead of her contains more than she planned for, but she has done the routine with care, and the reflection in the mirror looks back at her with the particular satisfaction of something completed to a standard she set for herself. And for this moment, the mirror is her collaborator rather than her judge, and the day can begin now. Thank you for spending this evening here. Sleep well. The thread that runs through all of tonight's stories is the thread of transmission, the way knowledge moves between people who trust each other with real things, in real rooms, in real time. The beauty counter salesgirl who turns a return into a lesson. The Helena Rubinstein chemist who explains to a client not just what to use, but why the chemistry works the way it does. The mother at the bathroom door watching her daughter perform the routine for the first time without guidance. watching her get the eyebrow pencil right on the first try, watching her blot the lipstick on a folded square of tissue, not because anyone is watching, but because that is simply how it is done. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.